This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Jeremy Wirtes of Triple Crossing Beer in Richmond, Virginia. If you're a reader of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, you might recognize them from our IPA issue, where their all neon-like IPA scored an incredibly high score, and that one kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't as familiar with the brewery as I should have been, and that caused me to do some digging. And here we are in Richmond, Virginia, talking with Jeremy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Tell me a little bit, give me a little, couple minute background arc on Triple Crossing, your history in a nutshell.
Sure. I'd been, like a lot of guys, I think, in the industry right now, a longtime home brewer, who probably got told incorrectly that their beers were so good they should sell them to people.
Incorrectly? What does that mean?
I mean, it's so hard to know where you really match up unless you've done a lot of legwork, on checking those things out through like vast tasting panels or people you really trust in the industry, of which I had none of that. So it's just it can often be misleading, but it also gives you some hope that maybe you can make something like that fly.
I know you say that, and I hear this all the time. Well, I should have known better, or people told me my beer was good. What really matters, I think, in that question is not that you make great beer as a home brewer, but that you have the mentality to know how to improve as a brewer as you get into that commercial world. Because certainly it's great to know what you're doing from the outset, but not a single person, even folks with extensive commercial brewing experience, they still don't know exactly what they're doing when they launch a new brewery.
For sure.
You're creating a whole set of new variables and you're having to solve those. And so that mentality of understanding how to solve the problem might be more important, and then having a palate that understands how to listen and learn from fellow brewers to see where things are going. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that might be my perspective.
No, I guess ultimately my point is just a terrible way to go about opening a brewery when you've never had any sort of commercial experience before.
Sure.
I think it's. I think a lot of us, get very lucky with it, and that's great. But to go into that with knowing what I know now, that it's super dicey.
Right.
So we kind of recognized two other business partners, Adam Wooster and Scott Jones.
Yeah.
We kind of recognized that with the law change, the SB 604 bill that had gotten passed several years back, you could have a tasting room and serve your beer on site without the food component, and that just seemed like if we were going to do something, that would be sort of like an incubator way to start doing it and to do it as right and as good as we possibly could.
And that bill seems to be the thing that kickstarted a lot of breweries.
For sure, without question. It just
I think that was the one that made Hardywood Park kind of possible. And
and to those guys' credit, they helped spearhead a lot of that, and they opened before that too. And I think they kind of had some faith that maybe it was going to turn around. And everyone's got them to thank in some degree for that, for sure. So for us, it was just, we recognized that like the brewers that were in town at the time weren't focusing on hoppy beer pretty much in any way. It was just, the scene as it is now is really in its infancy at the time. And I thought that was something we could do on a small scale, do it right, not package beer to start with, because that was something that really made me nervous and still does to this day, despite that we're canning now. But just didn't want to bite off any more than we could really chew at the time. And thought that we could control it by a small system, 7 barrels, put the batches on. If something was wrong, it would all be, in-house. We could control it. We could pull it back. And it just made sense to try and do it on the smaller scale for us. So that was our focus when we opened. And it still is to this day. Hoppy beer is just one of those things that you constantly keep chipping away at.
When we were talking before the podcast, you made an interesting point that I thought was good. When you launched that 7-barrel brew pub, were very deliberate and intentional about not packaging beer. About only serving it off of your tap. Because you weren't confident in the beer that you made that it that if it had been packaged, that it could stand up,
right,
to that kind of thing and taste the way that you intended it to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, without the, we've got a C box from Anton Parr, one of the dissolved oxygen meters, one of the higher end dissolved oxygen meters, coming to us here shortly because we're canning a lot more now. Like without equipment like that to know that each vessel that beer is going into, that it's in its best possible condition, that's just a variable we weren't really willing to go with. We didn't want to just risk it on that. We really wanted them to be fresh, vibrant, and also have the community feedback side of what people tell you, what they like and what they don't. You can actively see by looking at sight glasses from serving tanks what sells and what's not working. It just gives you another way. And we kept the batches small too, which is also nice to be able to rotate out constantly.
Yeah.
So it was all of those things rolled into one is why we went that way.
When you launched, which was, I guess, 2014.
Correct, yeah.
The beer world was a little different then. It seems crazy to say about 4 years ago, but 4 years ago there were at least 4,000 fewer breweries in the country.
Yeah.
Maybe 3,500 fewer breweries in the country. And, probably, 10 fewer here even in Richmond.
Yeah.
That may have afforded you a little bit of a runway to kind of
I think it did.
Get up to speed.
I think it did for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think at that time, we were feeling ourselves out at the time. And other people were feeling out what beer was and what the Richmond beer scene was at the time. I mean, it was no secret that, the IPA we opened up with was the fastest seller. I mean, that's just been, I guess, since time immemorial these days that hoppy beers are going to do, the best. That was that way back then. But, and that same brand we still do make today. And it hasn't changed so much other than the fact that, an overall yeast change to our entire profile happened really early on with us.
What do you mean by that? A yeast change early on?
Yeah, so we'd started making these beers. We really wanted to some of the earlier iterations of Union Jack from Firestone were a big influence on our IPA side, and I think honestly, that probably a lot of New England IPA, believe it or not, I think despite the clarity issue, English ale strain, tail end dry hopping. Yada yada. I mean, you name it. There's a lot of factors that beer is almost an archetype for how a lot of those the newer beers are made.
You
today.
are crediting Firestone Walker Union Jack with being an inspiration for hazy New England style IPA.
Maybe it's a stretch, but I don't think it's unfair. That beer's still great.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It just we went to a Fuller's type ale strain to start, and we were having attenuation problems and we couldn't get them the way we wanted them to. And so we kind of quickly look, we're going to focus on hoppy beers. We should just make these things, with California ale yeast. Let's give it a shot and see what happens. And I wasn't happy with them. I just don't for hoppy beers.
What year was this?
2014, right into 15, probably.
Okay.
Yeah. Just weren't super thrilled with them.
Yeah.
Just not what I wanted. And I love beers made with that strain for sure, but it's just like for what I wanted, I thought that we'd gotten something with the ester profile from some of those British strains. So we went back to the drawing board with it and trialed out.
Were there other beers that you were drinking at the time that kind of evidenced what that might taste like?
On the English side?
Yeah.
Or who else was making those? Oh, Ithaca Flower Power.
Yeah.
That's rumored to be a pretty venerable, high-flocking British strain. Bell's Two Hearted is supposedly an American ale variant that was once a British strain. They offered something a little bit more than just straight cleanliness. I thought you could get another component out of that, and I just didn't want to abandon it. I really wanted it to work. So we went back to the drawing board and tried several, almost probably all of them, until we kind of settled in on the one we have now. They caused some alarm at first.
What do you use now?
It's an English variant.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an English variant for sure.
Fair
it's
enough.
a popular one that probably wouldn't be too hard to figure out.
Okay.
But it is English in origin.
Yeah.
So that they were turning out hazy, and I wasn't necessarily all that freaked out about it, but we were biofining some early to try and see if maybe we could. But then it just felt like we were deadening them in some way.
Yeah.
It just didn't have that same raw, ripping character when they were fresh and young. And I really liked that about that. And then I figured, we'll just put them on. We'll see if anyone says anything. We were that fearful about it. And it just, no one said anything. And they were fine with it. It just, Richmond just took right to it. And, and then, definitely other brewers, in the Northeast were making these beers too. This wasn't an archetype or anything like that. It's like we invented fire here. But I do think that it was really great to watch, our local community just like get behind what these beers are and not freak out about the fact that they didn't look like what they're used to.
Yeah. Yeah, the typical story for folks that are brewing hazy IPA today was, that kind of early to mid to late 2015, trying to reverse engineer your, Trillium and Treehouse beers.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that happened a little bit earlier for you, and you weren't necessarily, trying to model them after something.
No, it really wasn't. They just took on their own direction with these other yeasts, and it became. And we're still really heavily, like our grists are almost every hoppy beer we make is 2-row and malted wheat. We don't use, we're pretty simple on that. And if they've stayed that way, it hasn't really changed but so much.
Does that have anything to do with your water? What kind of water do you have here in Richmond?
It's really, really soft brewing water.
Interesting. Okay.
The parts per million doesn't change too much. Calcium's right at 30, sulfate's super low, 18 to 20 give or take, and chloride's almost right around there too. So we pretty much, it's almost distilled.
Wow.
It's close enough to it where we do need to add, if we want to, minerals back into our water. We get it checked quarterly, and it doesn't fluctuate but so much that we found. We're on the end of the line down here at our Fulton production site. And the Stone guys are cool enough to send numbers over sometimes too, so then I can avoid paying for the testing. So
now that you bring that up, that's an interesting question. So you guys opened up this facility in 2016.
Correct.
And Stone has recently opened up, I guess, within the last year.
18
months?
Yeah, maybe they were just about then, yeah.
Okay. Opened up their much significantly larger production facility.
Yeah, things
about 3 minutes away, according to Apple Maps that I just used to get between the two.
Yeah.
What's it like having a very, very large big brother down the road like that?
Yeah, they've been real good to us. They were early adopters of our tasting room for sure. Mm-hmm. They showed up on our first canning day. They've been. There's a story. We had a din fitting on one of the racking arms of our tanks that just wasn't going to fit anymore that day, and we were going to knock out into it. So we were about 3 hours away from having to either dump it. Well, definitely from dumping it. So talked to our friend Jim over there, runs our filtration stuff, and he got us the fitting because they have those lying around because we should have them lying around, but as brewing goes, you often don't have exactly what you need right then. And then if that didn't work, they offered to send their in-house stainless sanitary welder to hack it off and weld a new one on before we knocked out. I mean, if that's not neighborly, I don't really know what is. They've been real good to us.
That's an interesting story. They caught a lot of heat when they moved into, when the word arose that they were going to move into Richmond.
Yeah.
And, certain folks were raising their eyebrows that this big, I don't want to call them a behemoth because they're still not an Anheuser-Busch, scale. But.
No, and I think maybe some of that too is probably on the financials of how their stuff was funded. But from a brewer's perspective, I have only good things to say.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Although they were telling me that it's all a bond issue that they are paying back.
I'm sure it is. Yeah. We have. Opening one of these is difficult enough. Yeah. I can't imagine what they must have had to go through.
Virginia, as a state, has been pretty aggressive about trying to court craft brewers and alter the laws of the state to make it more friendly for craft beer production. It's kind of interesting to see at the state level, and we see that in a few states. Cuomo in New York has done the same kind of thing, the farm beer law. But especially in trying to court Deschutes and Stone and others. I mean, Virginia had to go change a lot of things to make the state more attractive to those producers and compete against, say, North Carolina.
For sure.
For some of those larger scale production breweries. But in doing so, it's certainly made life for some of you guys on the smaller scale a little bit easier.
Yeah. They, I think Stone actually helped. They changed one of the sewer billing rules that they've got for lowering the wastewater treatment because they know that the way the chemicals go into the wastewater, with mixing acid and caustic together, it neutralizes other chemicals and other pHs of water coming from other sources. So that was one thing off the bat that I know they spearheaded that one. And I just think too that people just are a lot more accepting of what breweries bring to communities and what they bring. And that it's a place where people want to go. That we're fairly family friendly here.
Yeah.
It's something that people can go to on the weekends with their family and not feel like they're not supposed to be there. It's not a bar in that same traditional sense. So I think it's definitely made it easier.
Let's back up and talk about those hoppy beers again, because we kind of got sidetracked there. You get onto your English strain. You start brewing these hoppy beers that are what you want them to be, or closer to what you want them to be, and that they're expressing those hops in a more full and interesting way.
Yeah.
Where'd you go from there? How did word get out? I mean, how did demand build for multiple iterations of these kinds of things?
It did. We started making beers such as like our Clever Girl IPA, and that was also another big component of this. Is we were making beers at the time with hops we could get. So our mainstay Falcon Smash is heavily based on the Falconer's Flight hop blend.
I suspected that.
Yeah, it's fairly.
What about that name gives it away?
Yeah, it's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
And that was the hop, because as soon as we got our federal ID number to be an actual business, with nothing else, mind you, just that number, I called Yakima Chief and bought a pallet of spot hops as fast as we could with what they had available at the time, because we could not start contracting. That was never going to work. We weren't buying enough. But we were fortunate to get Centennial, Falconer's Flight, a little bit of Motueka at the time, which no one knew about. And some Cascade. That was the bulk of it at the time. So, I mean, we pretty much needed to make these hoppy beers with the hops we could get. That just was what it was. So Citra Mosaic hadn't come along for us until, I guess, about a year or so in. We started making beers like Clever Girl and then working those hops into other beers too. We started with that, and then as Falcon started to evolve, which, I mean, all these beers they're always evolving. I think that's a pretty common thing with most of us who are making, a couple thousand barrels a year these days. As they evolved, we were able to just tune them in the direction we want them to go with both hop choice and when, we add or take away different things, I think. So
let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, it's always an interesting subject to me, and to balance consumer expectation for consistency. Yeah, and this is something that the beer industry struggles with all the time. Balancing that idea of consistency in the brand versus that process of improvement and iteration, in the brew house. That you as a creative person, wanting to realize this vision and what you can taste in your mind. Yeah. It's going to be a process for you, but somebody buying that with that name on it has a certain expectation for it too.
For sure.
How do you balance those two things and those competing drives?
Yeah. For us, it's more about making sure that the beers are, the spirit of the beer remains behind. Yeah. I think that's important. Especially, and maybe a closer watch on exactly what the beer is for beers that are more readily available all the time. Like for our Falcon Smash IPA, that's the one beer we produce the most of, probably. Right. And the most often. So that said, though, like changing the dry hop on that is always okay. About 20 to 30% of the dry hop, we'll fool around with that.
Really?
Yeah. There's a lot of experimental varieties that we're able to get now, and we want to buy small quantities of them. And, I get very nervous about committing full batches to anything we're not familiar with yet. Yeah. So that it's really nice to be able to work that into a Falcon dry hop. And we'll notice a change to some degree, but the overall core of the beer doesn't seem to really change as much as some might think. At least we haven't heard about that yet. So I'll call that a win. But hey, like those things.
I mean, that's the core of hops blending from the very start. Using a broader selection of hops in a combination, so that if something happens or if a certain crop year doesn't
Firestone again,
right, isn't consistent, right?
There's something nice about having a couple of varieties to lean on, right, that you can sub in and sub out if something's not right. Because we'll open bags of things. Even bags of hops we spent a lot of money on, and they are not that great. And those will go into the whirlpools if we need to. Or we'll sub, if we're not super pumped about the Galaxy we've gotten, and that's totally happened, then Vic's Secret's not a bad way to go to blend in to kind of give you some of that that Southern Hemisphere pineapple. Yeah. You can't just do it one for one, and that's not necessarily the way it works, but it's really nice to be able to be a little bit more flexible given our production style and the way that we're not, totally locked into doing exactly this thing this way. So, I mean, ultimately,
what does that process look like for I mean, are you pulling them out and rubbing, your samples? Are you, looking at oil levels and concentrations of different oils?
We're unfortunately just not
or?
able to have selection just yet.
Okay. How many barrels does the brewery produce per year?
I think we're going to be at just about 4,500.
Okay.
For this year, give or take, between both.
You could probably select at that point.
We're working on it diligently to get that. Because that's something that we haven't gotten a chance to do just yet,
right.
And I think it's on its way.
Yeah.
But right now, it's kind of we take what we can get, and our suppliers have been good about if we're not happy with a lot, they will sub them out. So that's been good. But no, I mean it's opening the bags up right then and getting an idea about, all right, that lot. If we open a bag and the lot's good, then we can have some faith that the rest of the lot should be pretty good. You know, if we find a lot that we're not happy with, we'll either sub it out or we will definitely whirlpool some of those varieties too.
I think that's one of the interesting things, and I talked about it on the podcast with Jeremy Myers from Neshaminy Creek, and he said the same kind of thing, that this, that most consumers, when they're buying from small breweries, don't necessarily understand the challenge that small breweries face in even procuring the highest quality of some of these hops.
Right.
And that it can be a very expensive and sometimes wasteful process where stuff comes in and doesn't get used, and if you've just spent $25 or $30 a pound on some of these hops, like,
for sure,
it has to be heartbreaking.
It is. It's just frustrating in some ways. I mean, it's an agricultural product. We all understand that, and I think even beer drinkers understand that too. You know, I think they totally get it. But when you go through the processes to buy these hops and contracts multiple years out, you really do want them to be exactly what you want them to be.
Right.
At least within a range. And they can be really variable.
Yeah.
So it's just difficult to ensure that you're getting exactly what you want when these things come in. So I think you have to stay on top of it and not be afraid to make a call either. Just because it says Amarillo on it doesn't mean it's going to be great.
So what do you do in a small brew house like this? I mean, if you're a large scale Stone or Odell or New Belgium, I mean, you have entire groups of employees that do materials validation for all of your barley, all your hops, and anything else that's coming into the brew house.
Yep.
4,500 barrels. You guys, I mean, material validation has to be a little bit more of a your pants thing.
It totally is. Yeah.
What does that look like for you guys?
For us, it's tasting silo fills when we get them.
Okay.
It's also running them through our sieve test to make sure the crush is right.
Right.
So we're not seeing anything weird. We also do get an analysis sheet from BSG, so we can check in on things there.
Right.
From the yeast side of things, we've got a part-time lab guy who comes in diligently every Monday to Thursday to count cells so we can pitch based on viability and weight.
Yeah.
That really helps out a lot. It also helps us keep our processes in check and our various providers in check to see if our viability is holding really well for this.
Yeah.
But then for this one, it's not. Why is that? And I can actually have information for our yeast providers instead of calling them and freaking out.
Right.
Not that we haven't done that, because we have, but it's just not helpful. Like if you have a little bit more information, I think it's just always better.
Yeah.
And then for hops, it's simply opening them up and checking them out.
Yeah.
And making a call. And it's often, we like to get that sorted out before the dry hops are due on, especially these double IPAs. I think that's, or anything, double dry hopped or anything with a bigger rate. I think it's really important to have that ready to go prior. But
which again is a challenge, because you also don't want to open a bag and expose it to oxygen and let it sit around for a few days.
Yeah.
Then dry hop with it.
Yeah. That bag's toast.
Yeah.
Now, oftentimes that'll either make its way into a whirlpool either that day or within the next couple days, but it won't go back in the tank. We still buy everything in 11-pound bags.
So you only dry hop with freshly opened bags.
Yeah. We get everything in 11s that we can.
Okay.
And we pay a premium to do that.
Right.
We could get everything in 44s and pay a little bit less, but it's just so much easier when we can say everything's done in 11-pound increments. You open them up, they go in. Some of the varieties we have no choice.
Written your recipes in order to be in those multiples.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's we're at 20. That was part of the beauty about having the 20-barrel system, was that it's a pound per barrel. Once you have two 11-pound bags, give or take. So it works out really, really well. So we can just, we can just set what we want based on the poundage there. I just partially open hot bags. Just don't. Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I just prefer not to. I'm sure. I'm sure it works for a lot of people.
You're not the only brewer that has that.
Yeah,
opinion.
I just would rather not. So some of the Australian stuff, we don't have a choice. It's all like a lot
Right.
of that's done in 22s.
Okay.
But we make that work too. It's always round up, So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that it's an interesting point, and I think that I get to see a lot of brew houses, and I see some folks that handle their hops in a way that I would handle them, and I've seen some that I've asked some questions about that.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, I think I can taste that in an end product, and I assume you feel that you can taste that in yours too.
For sure.
Enough to have instituted that kind of policy around it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just, you go from, we were getting, when we started, at Fushun, we finally started getting those hops, we were getting them in 1 pound bags from what essentially was a homebrew supplier.
Right.
And that was okay. It worked for a while, but the variability there would be even, a little bit rougher than it is now. We're getting it from, BSG directly or,
right.
YCH directly and Willamette Valley directly. So it's a little bit different for us now.
Sure. And there's big questions like, especially when you're buying from somebody that's buying a bale or buying, a 44 pound and then subdividing it, like, are they nitro flushing it?
Correct.
Or is there oxygen in that package? And,
right.
and is that going to cause some degradation of that hop?
Yeah.
How they're packaged really can matter with these things.
It does for sure. And that's another reason why we like to go with multiple suppliers for even the same hops. It gives us the opportunity to, you'll get variable lots of Citra from different suppliers that
sure.
One's pineapple and one's dank and one's super mango-y, and then you can blend them all together to get the best of all the worlds rather than worry about one for one. That's something we've done when we can for different beers. And it kind of just lends, especially when it's a single hop beer, that lends a lot of roundness to that hop character, especially when you're counting on that varietal to be a certain thing. So
it's an interesting one to combine different lots of the same hop to you're doing your own blending.
We're totally not the only ones to do it, I'm sure, but it does. And other brewers, I'm sure that you open these bags of the same hop and they don't smell the same.
Yeah,
and it's also difficult too to know. You're kind of shooting for a target post when they go in and have now given their character to the beer.
Yeah,
at a given time in that process for that beer. As you're smelling them when they haven't done that yet. Like you're shooting for a target that's way further away when you open the bag and smell them.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it smells great in the bag, but we know that, certain varietals will do different things at different points. It kind of gets a little bit tricky when you expect, Mosaic to smell like this right now when you tear it open and knowing that you're going to use it in, a late fermentation dry hop or even, post fermentation dry hop.
What are some of those, changes in the hops or with any specific variety?
Yeah, it just seems
I'm curious about that. And this is something that I think all brewers have to deal with. You're envisioning a beer, but the way it even tastes straight off the tank, even after the dry hop, is different than how it tastes packaged a month out.
And I think it's wholly based on every as far as where the beer is in its current state when you decide to make that dry hop, obviously, and it's yeast driven. It's probably pH driven too, to some degree. But with Mosaic, for example, I find that if you open a bag and you're getting some diesel early on and some of that big hit of evergreen, that tends to on a mid fermentation dry hop, a lot of that just gets either driven off, or you get a little bit more of that deeper blueberry and grapefruit resin, instead of just straight pine, you know, and some of that diesel character that can be. Not that we don't love that too, because we do. But that hop specifically seems to do that a little bit more than some of the others do. And, on the mid-fermentation dry hop, a lot of these, they just seem to get a little bit rounder. You might lose some of the punch that they're going to deliver because there's still a lot of activity going on. I think there's some truth to that for sure.
Okay.
Of course, it's hard to know what's true in mid-fermentation dry hopping. I don't think anyone's got a full handle on it yet, but...
Still a lot of science to be done.
I think so, yeah. But I think brewers are feeling their way through it all, and everyone's got their own way of doing it. But I think some of those varieties tend to just change a little bit versus just sending them in on when the fermentation's totally done.
It's an interesting one because from a commercial perspective, you also tend to on your beer labels and descriptions of your beers talk about those specific hops because there is a consumer expectation and consumers that that have developed a knowledge of the hops that they like, and if they like certain hops combinations, and if you see Citra and Galaxy, like, I know that beer's going to be great because I love Citra and Galaxy
for sure.
I know it's got Nelson Sauvin. I love Nelson Sauvin, but some people
it can turn people off. Yeah,
right. And so those hop names have become this shorthand that some consumers now use to make some decisions about beers. Yeah. But it's a weird thing when you go back to this idea that you just raised that that's less predictable than certain folks might want to believe it is in terms of describing what those things actually taste like.
I think so. I mean, I think there's, I've had Citra beers from us and many other people, and they can be wildly different, despite using probably similar processes and even yeast strains sometimes.
Yeah.
And then it begs the question a lot of times, like, why? What is that? Is that, are they getting a different Citra, crop than we are? Are they getting, like, when are they dry hopping? What temp are they at? Like, how does that all come to play? And then post, packaging handling too, like, or pre-packaging handling, like, what's DO like? Is a little bit of oxidation doing other things to some of these beers that's not fully detrimental immediately?
Yeah.
It's just hard to know sometimes exactly where that stuff's going to end up.
Yeah. What, speaking of dry hopping, process, what does yours look like?
Depends on the beer.
Okay.
But oftentimes, if we're going to do a late fermentation dry hop, it's pretty standard for what I think everyone else is probably doing. Just about at the tail
standard
end.
With what everyone else is doing. That's
I don't
interesting way of putting it.
We're not going super early.
Okay.
We're looking for, maybe like a full degree Plato above finishing gravity.
Okay.
And in they go. And everyone's in the tank at that time. All kids in the pool, and then usually
just
that'll be
open the top of the tank, drop them in.
Yeah, just send them in. Yep.
Okay.
Let it rip.
Bags.
Yeah, no
recirculation.
Bags. No, they're just
rouse
in.
It at all?
No, we just let them go.
Okay.
Once they're in, and that normally is the similar blend of what's going to see on the second dry hop.
Yeah.
We tend to stick to that. We've done Temperature, we're normally right at free rise, so we'll be somewhere around 68 to 72, depending on how big the beer is at that time.
Okay.
So they'll go in. We'll let those go for 3 to 4 days, depending. We'll then drop those out of the bottom of the tank, keeping the temp the same. Drop those out of the bottom of the tank, and then we'll re-dry hop again with the same varietals. Usually we'll go another, twice over, give or take, depending on how big we want to go for them, and also dependent too on.
So you are double dry hopping.
Well, that's a sticky question. We're definitely on double IPA where it's almost always 2.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely. And for our Triangle Series beers, which are IPAs at 6%, those are getting 2 separate dry hops also. Yeah. And it also be dependent on too on. For whatever reason, we get really great character out of most of the mosaic that we get. That we find that we don't have to dry hop those necessarily as much as other hop varietals do. Like, and I don't think it's a big secret, but like Cascade is not going to show up at a pound per barrel in the same way that like Mosaic will.
Yeah.
So we do take some of those things into consideration too if we don't want to favor one over the other, and that'll change from, batch to batch if we're brewing the same beer again, which. We don't brew these beers every week.
Right.
They're far enough away from the last one that like we're trying to do our best to replicate it, give it the soul of what that beer previously was. Because we have so many different like double IPA brands and IPA brands that we rotate them back out. And by the time we come back around to them, it's been months since we brewed that again.
Are the recipes for these beers generally consistent with the variable only being hops that's changing out, or do you have some different approaches to grist or yeast handling?
The grist is almost always the same.
Okay.
We'll adjust how much malted wheat to 2-row just to do that. We'll throw in some flake stuff from time to time, but it's not. It's more for us to be able to see what that does. To the finished beer.
And small percentages?
Really small percentages, like 5%.
Okay.
Give or take. We'll do yeast pitch rate changes too, just to see what we think that does.
Yeah.
We're also fooling around with...
What have you found on that?
Nothing conclusive yet, to be honest. On smaller beers, we tend to pitch a little bit less, right around the 0.75 to 0.85 million cells per mil range. On some of the bigger beers, we like to do the traditional, a little bit closer to 1. We're fooling around with dissolved oxygen in wort on its way to the tank. That's super inconclusive right now. We just started that process. We got a DO meter just separate for that.
Okay.
So we're just starting to play around with that idea now, adjusting how much oxygen the wort gets, and trying to make that consistent to see if we can, eliminate some variability there. So yeah, otherwise they're the double IPAs and IPA, they're pretty much a blueprint as the wort goes into the tank in many, many ways.
Yeah.
It's hop choice, hop varietal, the sourcing side of things that really tends to show the biggest changes at this point. So yeah.
Interesting. In terms of hops combinations, what are some of your favorites? I mean, they're classics, and
right now, Mosaic and Falconer's Flight. There's something about that that I kind of, I don't know, I can't explain it because it really.
And Falconer's Flight is itself a blend.
It is, and it changes every year.
Yeah.
They don't tell you what they change it to, but it's a blend of most of the C hops plus some experimentals.
Yeah.
That either did work or probably didn't work for them. But they work those into the blend, and as a blend goes, it's always been really consistently great for us. Like we've never had I've never had an issue with wanting to get rid of any of that.
Yeah.
So that, for whatever reason, Mosaic and Falconer seem to really play well together. That's a favorite. We've got a beer out right now called The Grid that features those two solely. And then really, when we can get good Columbus, Citra Columbus is also another personal favorite. We have a Green Dreams double IPA that we do that's kind of a rotating hop varietal beer. So the brand stays the same, but it's a constant change of what those hop varieties are. And I normally pick two.
We're getting back to the Firestone inspiration here again, aren't we?
A little bit,
Sounds a lot like Luponic Distortion to me.
I think that did. I think Green Dreams might have come out first. I'm not sure. It's fine. I'll deflect. I'm sure they did it before we did. But my guys, I've got five brewers back there who they'll come up with ideas for different hop combinations for those, and we'll go over how much we want to favor this to that depending on what we want to find. But Citra Columbus is something that came out of that it seems pretty obvious given how old they both are now, but there's something about the super overripe mango and then dank pine grapefruit peel that seem to come together really nice, because dank is not something we'll shy away from. Columbus is also I just love that hop. Big fan of early on, what was that beer from DC Brow? It's 100% Columbus IPA. I thought that was really ballsy of them. Corruption, I think, was 100% Columbus.
Yeah.
I think that can definitely work sometimes, but I love blending that hop in.
Yeah. In order to highlight, these kind of hop flavors, a little bit of residual, sugar in that beer tends to help make them pop. What are your goals for, final gravity on the beers?
For IPA, I really like 3.5 to 4, give or take. Double IPA, we fought this for a long time. And we'll be somewhere right around 4.5 to 4.8, maybe even 5.2. And
when you say fought it, what does that mean?
Yeah, it just, in my head, I couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
It drove me nuts.
But theory.
But then I would taste them and I would go, well, they're great. Like I'm very, I'm happy with it.
Yeah.
Like they sound sweet on paper, but then you have them and they just don't feel that way. They feel plush, they feel full. They feel delicate. They don't have, a dryness or a bitterness to them that, no matter what the final gravity and the hydrometer was saying, our palates and minds were telling us that this is what we want them to be. So kind of have just let that be what it is. And it's also, we've done forced ferment tests with our yeast strain, and that's just where we get.
Yeah.
So if we want to change up yeast character, which we've experimented, and even over here at our production site with 40-barrel tanks, we fooled around with other yeast strains. We just keep coming back to it, which is also great validation for the fact that should be the strain we use for a lot of these beers,
Yeah.
But we also like playing around too. Yeast is a huge flavor component, I think, for what these beers are. I think they're really yeast forward.
Yeah.
More so than I used to think they probably were. So I think it's great to play around with them, but it's also nice to be able to validate what you are using already. So,
do you have specific IBU goals in mind for these two? Because I mean, IBUs are the other thing that can kind of counteract that perception of sweetness.
Pretty low for everything.
Yeah.
There's not much.
Are you doing any initial bittering charges or bittering charges on the hot side? It's all whirlpool.
Everything's in the whirlpool. Okay. Yeah. No, everything's in the whirlpool for these guys.
Yeah.
And it's whatever's smelling great at that time.
Okay.
We're also not.
What kind of temperatures are you whirlpooling at?
Full on. As soon as the boil's off, they're going in. Yeah, we don't do the recirc thing to get them cold.
Yeah.
Not that I'm against it. We just don't have the setup to do it. And I've heard from a lot of other guys that make really great hoppy beer that they've trialed it and they haven't found a bunch of luck with it. So I've kind of moved on from it.
Okay. It was interesting when I was talking to Andy from Great Notion that they use that whirlpool temperature as their bittering control. And if they want to, if they wanted more bitter, then they whirlpool at a higher temperature,
and then they get more hops in the tank based on that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting strategy. I didn't know how you guys manage that on a whirlpool.
We keep
side.
our whirlpool charges
hops volume then.
Yeah, and it's also a really small charge too.
Okay.
We'll be right at £1 per barrel on most of these beers. It's not much.
Yeah.
And then we'll take that pound, the extra pound or 2 per barrel you might see in a whirlpool, and we'll move it to the dry hop. When we're still keeping roughly the same amount of wort in the tank.
Yeah.
So it's just a nice trade-off to not have to sweat, going that other route of like lowering our tank or lowering the whirlpool temperature and then sending hops in. So it's also another tool we use to help evaluate some of these dry hops.
Yeah.
So if something's not smelling super great for dry hopping, it can go into the whirlpool on almost any given beer. I mean, it'll go into a Falcon batch when the previous batch didn't get that same whirlpool hop.
What one of the other things that a small brewery like you all have to work through and build processes around is finding ways to work customer feedback into your brewing process. How do you gauge or judge what consumers are liking, what hops combinations they might like, and be more interested in buying? Do you have kind of informational systems that allow you to see how fast stuff is moving, or do you look at, say, online reviews and get feedback there? How do you figure out okay, this is what people really, really like from us, and we've because what your consumers like may be different than what you like.
Yeah, I think for us it's it's also we check case counts every day.
Yeah,
that's super helpful because we can just walk in there and take a look. That plus, I mean, always the online reviews. You have to watch that stuff too. That's important.
You don't have to, but
yeah, I think almost everyone probably has to in some way.
Yeah.
I know we do. So we
just check them before you've started having your first beer of the day.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah, there's at least one guy on the team who probably looks at them a little bit more than he should. And he's gonna laugh when he hears this.
Yeah.
And it can either be really great or it cannot be.
Sure.
Sure. There's usually no middle ground there.
Yeah.
So we look at that stuff too, and then we'll get feedback too from just the social media side of things of you can tell when certain hop combos or certain brands resonate with people and they really, really like them. Interstellar Burst is a big one for us that people seem to have gravitated to.
What's that combination?
That is Galaxy Vic Secret Eldorado, if I can remember it right. Don't quote me on that one. I have to look. There's
someone's going to check it on Untappd.
Oh, for sure.
That's not what the description is.
I'm sure I'm wrong.
They can fact check us.
Yeah. That one is that was a very hard hitting brand for us that did really well, and we've only brewed it twice, I think, and both at times it's done really well. So we see things like that, and then we'll work those beers back into the rotation for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also some of that, is important. We want people to have what they want, obviously, but then a lot of it too is we're making a ton of hoppy beer. It's not a super difficult thing to get people to get behind.
Yeah.
And it's also for us it's just a constant evaluation of both process and our ingredient choices. So it's really nice to be able to let that beer sit for a little bit as far as the idea goes and come back to it in like a month or two, because we thought we'd have like a year-round core double IPA.
Yeah.
We thought Nectar and Knife would be that. And it was the first time we'd ever gotten enough Simcoe and Mosaic to make anything. And that's what we went with. And that beer hasn't changed. It's been Simcoe and Mosaic since the beginning. But we thought that would be like our year-round double IPA. We'd always have that available at least a couple times a month. And that's never been true. It's just not. There's too many other fun things to get to. And now that we've gotten a little bit bigger in our brewing size, and we have some hop providers, getting us like this is the first year we've ever been offered Nelson. So on any large scale, so we can actually make like a double IPA over here with it. So we're bringing the Proposition back, which was a brand we brewed really early Fuchsia days. We can get a little bit of Nelson and Galaxy. So we're able to brew that here now. So there's all these hop varieties, and they're constantly like, the cryo pellet thing, the cryo powder, like, and the extract stuff. Like there's so many products to try that wanting to constantly rotate out these brands is something we kind of want to do.
Yeah.
I think maybe once we get to where we have a core like stable of ones we're very happy with, we're starting to revisit those a little bit more. But there's still a lot of experimentation.
That is like the challenge that small breweries face. And I was talking to Joe Morfeld of Pint House Pizza about this for our Brewing Industry Guide story, and he talked about how there's so many different hops varieties that he has access to, but he pared it down to 6. Because when he pared it down to 6, they were producing 3,500 barrels this year. He could select. Yeah. And so, for him, he almost like a painter saying, I'm only going to use these 6 pigments, and I'm going to have to find creative ways to mix that into something else. There was a benefit of kind of doing that. And so,
for sure.
As you're talking about this, I get what you're saying. Like, you've got all these options, but at the same time, you also have to take a discipline and an economy towards this.
For sure.
And say, there are some things I am going to try and some things I'm not going to try.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's hard to turn down something cool and new. We just got a provider reached out to us the other day about I think it's a new hop. I don't even think it's got a name yet. I think it's got one of the numbers attached to it, and they're like, "Can we put you down for a 44-pound box?" And I can't say no. I want to try it. Let's see what's what with it. And even if it's obviously not enough to make a batch at our production site, but like, Fuchsia Street, 7 barrels, like we can play with that. And that's what that's become a lot of too, is a place to do things like that. And if, we're not happy with it, it's not the end of the world to send 7 barrels down the drain. Sure. It really isn't. Sure. Now that we're fortunate enough to have, this other production site to where that's not our everything anymore. Yeah. We can take a risk over there and not worry about it. But it is difficult to factor those things into beers already work, or like brands that already are kind of set in what the varietals are, and then to try and throw another variable in on top of them with a new like hop product or new variety, it can get a little iffy. So it is a delicate balance. Also, I also want to constantly, seek out new things that are interesting, because at the end of the day, a lot of these beers they're super hop forward. They're really big, they're expressive. And I think to keep it interesting, you kind of need some character changes once in a while. Yeah. So
let's talk a little bit about the Richmond and Northern Virginia, beer scene. You all, in an interesting way over the last 2 years with, between Triple Crossing and the Answer and the Vale, and then a little bit further north, folks like Aslan up in Herndon, Virginia, this culture of kind of pushing each other and putting out can releases that are attracting lines and interest from consumers it's become a thing here when it wasn't a thing like that 2 years ago. How much does that and I'll call it competition, but it's friendly competition and challenging each other, and being able to then I almost equate this to use an art metaphor to artists painting in a similar school of painting who are inspiring each other, but also putting their own spin on things, but also seeing new options that arise because they're also consuming the work of their contemporaries. But what that does is create an interesting movement, where artists can respond to artists and push things forward in a way. Yeah. This has to be an interesting place for all of you as significant brands that now have some national notoriety and some folks trading for them around the country to some degree. How does that impact how you brew, and how what you brew impacts some of your peers here?
Yeah, I mean, I know from for our perspective, like the beauty about having the space that we do over here, at Fulton, it lets us. We don't really have to say no to anything that we want to try. Over there, it was it's ale only, like fairly quick fermentations to turn the tanks over to get beers back on for certain, and it just became, there were other things I wanted to try, like, barrel fermented, mixed culture beer, a Solera program that we've got now with the fooders that we have. This is our first foray into bourbon barrel aging over here. We got some in last January and it's just resting now. And so we get to, we put a cool ship in, for the first season last year and brewed a couple of batches.
How'd those go?
Just
tell me in a year.
Who knows? It went well from what we can tell early on, but we'll see. Those things are, and I guess what my point is, the beauty of all that stuff is it doesn't show up anywhere on like, this has to happen now. This has to turn over. Like, we have to make this work. Those things are projects that if they never see the light of day, it's not going to really affect the rest of it, because we are able to offer those can releases and get some notoriety behind those beers. So for us, I want us to be a well-rounded brewery, with still a focus on a couple of core things, but I want to do those things really, really well. And given, some of the space constraints I think some other guys have, that's a little bit tougher for them. We're just really fortunate here, so we can do those things. I also want to offer like the on-site experience of what we have here versus what some of probably other guys do. Like, we've got a full-on pizza kitchen out there, cranking out really great pizzas every day. That's a little bit different, I think, than a lot of the other tasting rooms in the state. It's not super uncommon elsewhere, but I think in the state it probably is. So I think for us, being able to offer mixed culture, barrel fermented beers regularly, and then our lager program has been picking up, and that's full of experimentation right now. We're not canning a ton of that right now, unless we're super happy with something. So there's those styles we're seeing a lot of those right now, and people are really, really taking to those, and I think that's true probably across the country right now. And we're able to put some attention to those, especially with on the small batch side over at Fushi, because we can let those things sit, because that place no longer has to turn and like it once did.
How do you balance that? What you're talking about now is, as a brewer, being able to explore some creative projects that you didn't have the bandwidth or the tank space for before. But regardless, this brewing is still a business. It's not a. If you wanted to brew whatever you want to brew, you just remain a home brewer.
It's the easiest way to do it,
right? And just go for it that way, right? But you launch a business, well, you have to sell that product.
You do, and I think we got really lucky with what we want to make on the hoppy beer side is what's selling the best, I think, for everybody right now. Like, that's always been true for us, luckily. If people don't like hoppy beer tomorrow, we're going to be in some hot water. I can definitely tell you that. But it's just a lot less dedicated to the production of those beers. Of the other styles, the mixed firm beers and the lagers. We can't make as much of those because it just doesn't make sense for us to make a bunch of it right now.
Right.
And there's something really nice too about having those beers stay smaller side projects that we can validate the results of them in-house in the tasting rooms. That's a really nice feature of those things right now. We're constantly experimenting with those styles and chipping away at them the same way we've done and are still doing with hoppy beers. We just, we focused on those way more initially to start with because we simply needed to.
Sure.
So, but it's been really nice to be over here and to be able to start some of that stuff and then actually have and put people in place that are already on the team to dedicate some of their resources and time towards that, to let other people take some of the creative control over what we're doing and have it be a little bit more of a collaborative team effort too.
How's the consumer response? How do they take to things like a Pilsner or your farmhouse?
It's been really good.
Sorry, not your farmhouse, but your warehouse.
Our warehouse ale. It's been really great, honestly. Those beers, like on site, they just do really, really, really well. I think it's nice that if you're coming from out of town and you want to come see us for hoppy beers, that's great. It's awesome. That's why they're here, and we're focused heavily on that for sure. The draft list will dictate that pretty much every day. But if you're local, and you come in here as one of the places you stop in on a weekend, maybe you want a 4-ounce pour of the latest one to check it out. But maybe if you're sitting here hanging out with friends and having pizza, maybe you just want pills. you know, and that's where the magic of those beers. Same thing goes for our mixed culture beers and the warehouse ale. That thing comes into play with people who want to hang out here for a little while, because we do focus, even though they're double IPA, we keep pretty much everything at 8% for those. And our IPAs are generally at 6. Those are just 2 ABVs that I really, really like a lot for, consumption.
Yeah. What's next for Triple Crossing? You've moved from a brew pub. You opened this production facility. You've ramped up production. You've got a wonderful, hip, modern, cool tap room with a pizza kitchen out there.
Yeah.
You've got a nice hospitality side of this business. You've got a production side of this business. You produce beer that you're sending out on draft in the market. You do limited can sales 3 times a month that people line up for, and but where do you see this going? And what are your ultimate goals for the business?
I mean, the ultimate goal is, for me to be doing this for as long as I possibly can.
Yeah.
I just we have, we added 2 tanks this year, a 60 and a 40, and there's no plans to add any more right now.
Yeah.
The demand for our draft beer around town is still pretty high, and I don't think, we can't really meet that yet, and I don't know that we ever really will be able to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We like to take care of our retail partners for sure, but that's not the end of it, I want to do this.
Do you guys have a ratio around that? A certain amount that goes out and a certain amount that stays here?
Yeah, it's probably 35 to 40% that goes out
Okay.
across the board. But most of it is definitely on site, whether it's cans or draft. And then just
now you could brew more than that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, we've got room in this place to add.
So you choose not to kind of keep it at that kind of ratio.
Yeah, it's just a really nice, manageable size right now.
Okay.
We're also really focused on the on-site side of things.
Okay.
And how well that goes, and the total control. We just really.
Do you guys have outside investors with expectations for this business?
No, we don't. We've got outside investors, but they're pretty great about their expectations, and that we really don't hear too much from them.
Yeah.
They know, I guess they put some confidence in us early on to make sure that we're doing the right things, and they've seen it grow from what to what it is now. So,
right.
From that standpoint, no. We're just really fortunate right now to be in a position where we can make enough beer to make this thing viable.
Yeah.
Also have most of the control still and where it ends up, and be able to make payroll. It's kind of nice right now. We just
always a good thing.
It is, yeah. We just put the canning line in this year, so that was our last really huge thing, I think, for a little while. But I just want to focus a lot more of our efforts on, repeatability and a little bit more of the science and technology side of the brewing process than maybe we had before. Like I was saying earlier about our lab guy, he's kind of the first step into that, and just doing a lot more of that, especially with the canning line now and needing to make sure that the DO levels are where they need to be for the longevity of the cans and seam checks and all of those different things that go into it. So that's kind of where I see us going, is just constantly refining and dialing in. I mean, we're never all, I'm never like, it's never enough, it can always be better. It should always be better. It's a constant pursuit of that. And that's probably that's the thing that keeps me going the most, is that I will always expect them to be a certain thing, and I want to eventually get there, but probably never will.
Never being satisfied is actually a strangely fantastic place to be in this business.
It is, yeah. And I think that we're really lucky to have had, the support we've gotten to get here from people who show up. I mean, people come from all over the place, and that's, there's a lot of breweries around that get that kind of support, and for us to get that too has been pretty great.
Well, cheers. Jeremy Wirtes, Triple Crossing Beer. If people want to learn more about your brewery, where can they find you on the internet?
They can go right to triplecrossing.com. They can also check us out on Instagram, and
you have some pretty attractive pictures there on Instagram too.
Yeah, Scott Jones, one of my business partners of 2, that's his realm. He puts a lot of time into those things. Does a good job of them.
Yeah, nice. Well, thanks for talking with me on the podcast, Jeremy. Cheers. I'm going to drink some of your beer, and before I get out of here, and we're going to have a story in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, a breakout brewer story on Triple Crossing that you can read soon, all of you out there in podcast land. If you don't subscribe to the magazine currently, and you should if you are listening to this, just hop over to beerandbrewing.com right now and click on the subscribe button and solve that problem really quickly. You can find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. If you need to send me hate mail, you can do so at jbogner, JBOGNER, at beerandbrewing.com. Thanks so much for hosting us here in Richmond, Jeremy. Cheers.
Thanks for having me on, man. Appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.